And I'm going to make sure my screen is still being shared. Okay. And I got one message saying can't hear anything. I will go ahead and put a link. There's a link to the help section for Join Me. It's specifically a link to trying to call in and how to set up that. But from that site, you should be able to also ask any other questions that if you're having any issues connecting or anything like that. So hopefully that link can be helpful. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. A slide that says Digital Preservation Exploration, and there should be some tabs on top too. I don't know if we'll get to the tabs, but I have them there just in case. Great. So thank you everybody for joining us today for the Digital Preservation Exploration Summary Report meeting. And thank you everyone who has participated and assisted us along the way. It's been a very fun year putting this all together, and I appreciate all of you spending the time to participate and contribute. So jump right in. The plan for today basically is I'll provide some a general welcome and kind of an overview of just the basic meeting logistics. And then we'll jump into a report overview where I'll walk through the report that everyone should have access to at this point. But we'll walk through all the sections and kind of hit the main points of that. Many of you will be familiar with some of the key points already, but hopefully this will be an opportunity for people to learn more. And then we'll open the floor essentially to discussion and questions and kind of have more of a open floor. And then there'll be a brief wrap up at the end to just make sure everyone's on the same page about what's happening moving forward. So the welcome and logistics. First off, today's goal is to just put it out there, is to provide an overview of the Digital Preservation Exploration Summary Report and to provide a space for additional feedback and discussion. Since the goal of this entire project has been to seek out what's going on with digital preservation in North Carolina, this, as well as all the other things we've done thus far, is hopefully an opportunity for people to share their thoughts and their experiences. So we want this to double as that as much as anything else. These are the people involved kind of on the back end today. My name is Andrea Green. I'm the Digital Collections Manager at the State Library of North Carolina, and I'll be the primary presenter, so you'll probably hear my voice the most. We also have Amanda McClellan with East Carolina University, and she'll be kind of doing the question monitoring. So if you have a question, she just said hello in chat. So if you have a question, please add it to chat, and she'll help you kind of help make sure that I'm aware that there's a question and to make sure that all those things are getting addressed. We also have Liz Harper with Western Carolina University, and she'll be making sure we keep on track with time. And the other planning committee members from this project, David Gwynn and Lisa Gregory, David from UNCG and Lisa from NCDHC, or Digital NC as many people know, they're also on the line and here to help assist with the discussion and answering questions and kind of helping make sure everything runs smoothly. So that's who's kind of present. Many of you already have met us or heard our voices and names before, but welcome. And the technical overview, just briefly, I've put the link in chat for everybody if you have any issues, but generally, first off, this meeting is being recorded, and it will be made publicly available. So, and that'll be shared after the meeting. And we definitely welcome questions throughout the meeting. During the report overview, we ask that you add your question to chat, and we'll try to address those as they come in as appropriate. And then during the discussion portion, I'll unmute everybody and we'll have more of an open discussion so people can contribute and have more of a conversation for those who choose to do it that way. But chat, of course, is always an option. And again, the links in chat for technical difficulties, and hopefully there aren't that many. You can never really predict it, but hopefully. Are there any questions about kind of the logistics of today? Cool. And in case anyone is new to join me or hasn't found it yet, the chat, access to chat should be available at the very top of your screen. In the Join Me, there should be a little bubble that has like a symbol for like a chat bubble. If you click that, that should open the window. Okay. So now to the meat of it, the report, which my tone of voice made that sound very ominous. It is not. So some quick background about the project itself. The Digital Preservation Exploration was a statewide leadership project funded by LSTA and IMLS. It's an LSTA grant via IMLS, and was built off and are inspired by results from the 2017 Digital Summit Initiative. So the Digital Summit Initiative did a statewide survey and also brought leaders together to kind of have a conversation about all the digital needs of North Carolina. And one of the big things that came up over and over again and was identified as a big priority or an area that an initiative to be investigated further was digital preservation. But as many know, digital preservation can be a lot of things to a lot of people. So the goal of this was to take those results and then kind of delve deeper into what those needs could be, or what we mean by digital preservation and what that looks like in North Carolina. The project's been managed by a 5-person planning committee with members from across the state. I've just introduced them. So, and we've all worked together since pretty much last September to run this project. The goals of the project were to determine the goals and priorities institutions have regarding digital preservation, determine how feasible and sustainable those different digital preservation solutions would be for interested institutions, and identify potential approaches to future digital preservation initiatives and possible areas of collaboration. And last, to determine recommended next steps that the State Library can take in supporting all of these things. And kind of like fifth kind of floating goal or thing that kind of cropped up over and over again throughout this process is also that this project has also served to kind of help us start building a foundation of understanding of what digital preservation means in North Carolina. So what are people's understanding of it? What's some shared vocabulary? What is their situation? So that kind of affects all of these 4 things and is also just kind of a thing that's been a constant through this process. To do this, we decided to do 3 regional meetings, essentially trying to angle each geographic area of North Carolina, so middle, western, and eastern. The middle meeting was at UNC Greensboro, the western meeting was at Western Carolina University, and the eastern meeting was at East Carolina University. And approximately 15 to 20 professionals from North Carolina cultural institutions attended each meeting. And the meetings were approximately 6-hour-long workshops with large and small group activities. We also had the meetings facilitated by 2 State Library of North Carolina library development facilitators. It was important to us to have kind of objective, outside perspective facilitators helping to run the meeting, especially so that the planning committee could participate and engage, and so that we could speak kind of freely and from like the same space. The report itself that is now published and available, that resulted from these meetings, was compiled by the planning committee and based on the notes that were taken throughout each of these 3 meetings. The notes were taken by all 5 committee members and also the 2 facilitators. We also drew from any of the materials that we created during the meeting. So there were a lot of flip chart exercises and post-it exercises and things like that that were produced during different exercises. So we used all of that information to do essentially one big content analysis, and that's what resulted in the report. So who participated? This is one of the tables from the report. Essentially, invitations were sent to 70 different practitioners from a variety of cultural institutions across North Carolina. The majority of them were, about 44% of them were universities or colleges of different sizes, both public and private. 13% were museums, 16% were special libraries, 11% were public libraries, 10% community colleges, and 6% archives. So we tried to touch on all the different cultural institutions types, or as many as we could. Potential participants, we selected them they were selected by the members of the planning committee based on their individual geographic location, the institution they work for, and their professional role. But all the invitations were also made open to additional nominations and suggestions for people to attend. We did it this way with an invitation limitation because each meeting was capped at 30 participants max to stay within the budget of the grant. So of the 70 invitations that were sent, 45 accepted the invitation, and that excludes the planning committee members. And the ultimate breakdown of who attended in terms of institutions, as you can see in this graph, still it was the majority were university and colleges, both private and public, small and large. But then everyone else kind of had somewhat equal representation across the board. Community colleges really were mostly only represented at the middle meeting, but we had archives throughout, university or public libraries throughout, museums at the east and west, and specials at the west and middle. So we had what is hopefully a good representation of the different perspectives of different cultural institutions of North Carolina, though admittedly we can always do better. One of the goals of this project was to make sure those who were participating are from a variety of places and experiences, and that is something we can always work on to improve, make sure those voices are included. Here's another representation of that distribution of participants. This is an interactive map, and it's available and linked in the report as well, so you can actually click on the link and then zoom in and do different selections and kind of see more of a breakdown of who attended based on the places of work of those who participated. Blue is those who are the people that attended the West, yellow middle, red east, and then the green are the planning committee members or facilitators. One of the things you can note in this map is that there are chunks of North Carolina that we did not have participants from. So again, this is something that, as we move forward and as we include people and have these conversations, to be aware that there are areas that weren't necessarily initially a part of it, and making sure that those voices get included. At the beginning, are there any questions so far? Doesn't look like it. Okay. So at the very beginning of each meeting, we kind of did a icebreaker where we went around and we just asked, why are you here today? And it pretty much broke down into 3 main categories based on everybody's different answers. The first was to learn. So people had answers kind of related to the concept of they were here to learn about something, to learn about standards and best practices, about getting started in digital preservation. But also the most common answer was learn about what others are doing, to just essentially get a sense of what else is happening in North Carolina and where people are in it. Because as many of us know, it's really easy to kind of fall into this for lack of a better word, silo, where you don't have time to see what others who may be doing exactly the same thing you're doing and having the exact same questions you're having, what those people are doing. So this was an opportunity for them to learn from those people. Another category or theme that kind of propped up from these answers was to collaborate and network. So whether that means about like collaborating in terms of building internal partnerships at people's institutions, or about doing more for community collaboration, or just meeting colleagues at this event, regional and institutional, to foster more collaboration and networking, which was also, again, the meeting the colleagues was the most common one. So, and this in general was also a major theme of each meeting, the concept of let's not do this in a vacuum, let's collaborate and talk openly and have transparency about these processes. And then the third main theme was to address specific needs and questions. So this kind of broke down in all sorts of ways, but there were 5 main areas, at least, that people really wanted to talk about in more specific detail. Digitization, so a lot of times digitization is associated or really goes hand in hand with digital preservation. So a lot of people wanted to talk about their experiences with or them getting started with digitization. Another one was just basic problem solving. So it cuts off in the graph, but essentially the idea of like some general and specific situations that people are facing that they wanted to hear what other people are dealing with. And one example that stuck out was the concept of email. What are people doing with preserving email? Another was access and discovery. So addressing kind of the different needs and the different ways people are dealing with creating metadata or making their collections available, or considering their digital preservation from that discovery standpoint. Policy and program development was not as common, but another big feature where people wanted to know more about what others were doing in terms of developing their policies and kind of doing the work itself and creating those programs for digital preservation. And last, there was the advocacy and support, both how are people getting support for digital preservation at their institutions, but also how are people advocating for themselves. Are there any questions? No. Okay. So in addition to kind of finding out why people were there that day, we also kind of wanted to focus on what people's current status was. So we sent some general questions to people before the meeting and then had them walk through those questions. Almost all respondents to the question of what types of materials are involved said that they were collecting digital content created through digitization. That was the most common. And it seemed to be more of a focus of smaller institutions in terms of preservation, though most were also collecting BornDigital items at some level. The attention and turn towards BornDigital items through discussion seemed to be more recent, but a growing phenomenon to most institutions. And considerably fewer were also doing some form of web archiving. But most of them were doing that through the Archive.it or using Internet Archive's free tools. And most of those were also partnering with larger institutions or connected to larger institutions to fulfill those initiatives. There was a strong interest indicated that people wanted to talk more about a consortial approach to using tools like Archive.it for those types of web archiving needs. Digitization was also the primary area in which most participants were personally involved with digital preservation because their roles as the responsible parties for digitization or through coordination with internal or external responsible parties like the Digital Heritage Center. So in other words, most of people's connection to or pathway towards digital preservation was starting with digitization, and that was kind of the more familiar starting point for a lot of people. And then we did also have someone that serves on a campus digital preservation committee, which just sounds great. When we asked, do you use any tools or systems that you would recommend, there were kind of three main areas three main categories people's answers fell into. The most cited were usually content management system tools that are used for facilitating access to digital content and files. And people mentioned programs or platforms like Omeka and ArchiveSpace and Content DM. Google Drive was mentioned as a storage tool, as well as Amazon S3. So we also had a mention of Meta Archive Cooperative, but there were kind of like a caveat, especially with Meta Archive Cooperative, was always, the more complex these tools are, the more robust your internal IT infrastructure would need to be, which can be a limiting factor. Numerous file preparation tools were also widely used and discussed, so bulk rename utility, hash my files, all these types of kind of more open source free things that people can use to do kind of file processing and content processing. And project management tools like Trello was also used or mentioned as a project management workflow tool. In the report, we do have available a full list of the different tools discussed during the meetings with links to their corresponding websites and kind of a description of what they are. So hopefully that was a helpful resource to people. When we asked who's responsible for IT support, generally the reaction first and foremost was that IT support and having IT infrastructure was a significant issue for a lot of people. The predominant model among participants was that IT is controlled through a centralized department that is separate from the respondent's institution. So it's a campus IT staff, or it's a different department or a different area or division of where the person's working. There are some instances where the institution itself retained control of its own website, though. So there were some cases where people would maybe have the IT support separate from them, but then would have some control over some things. So a lot of these, who's responsible for IT support really fell into kind of very similar categories where it was external to people, or it was kind of more of a partnership where there might be one representative within that specific team, but mostly it's off or external. And then there's some where it's like we have complete control over this piece of the pie. With that said, several people mentioned a model, and mostly these were universities, where they had their own IT staff who worked in coordination, which would sometimes mean that the institution managed its own servers, but the space itself that the servers were in was managed by some external IT. People reported that they were usually the only staff member working with digital preservation, while at the other end of the spectrum, other people mentioned that they were on teams or had multiple staff members working on different aspects and task force. So essentially, the who is responsible for IT was all over the place. Most of that IT support at the grand scale was external, but then there were a lot of people who had either they wore all the hats or the hats were distributed among a lot of people. When we asked what would be helpful to your organization, people felt strongly that a network of regional contacts and in-person training would be the most helpful thing for their institution as they considered digital preservation. So just having contacts and knowing who they can reach out to with questions and with support and help. Having more communication and awareness, so, doing things with more of a back and forth and more of an updating transparency. Specific training with in-person training preferred was also often mentioned as something that would be very helpful, and we'll talk more about that later. Having an internal advisory group of some kind, and having policy management, priorities, scope, and institutional support. All three of these things kind of carried a similar weight among respondents. So as you can kind of see through this response and through a lot of these answers, including this one, what resources have you used? A lot of these answers are pretty high level. So people aren't talking about like specific technical needs, which is, I think, really telling about the current status for a lot of people dealing with digital preservation right now in North Carolina. So with what resources, a lot of people, statewide resource groups and programs were one of the biggest areas that people used, and this included the former NC ECHO group, the North Carolina Digital Heritage Center, and the Traveling Archivist Program. All of those were cited as things that were useful, and people who hadn't heard of them were enthusiastic about knowing about them now. Professional groups also were talked about regularly, whether they were national or North Carolina specific. And those were talked about as places where people could at least get understanding of different standards or kind of different tools to use. And then the idea that conferences, continuing education, regional partners and contacts, kind of those different pieces that can come together and help you build your program, digital preservation program. And then Google was also mentioned as just a sharing resource, collaboration resource that was just across the board very helpful to people. Are there any questions about current status? As I said, a lot of it, after having these discussions, it was a very high-level discussion. A lot of people, they're trying to do something, and their biggest concerns or the things they're most focused on are kind of the logistics of it and the planning of it. Okay. So we also had a section about, we provided an open-ended prompt to participants to discuss what they considered to be digital preservation best practices. And in that discussion, here's a word cloud of a lot of the answers we received, but in that discussion, two themes emerged. There was the theoretical discussion around the planning and management of digital preservation and practical methods of implementation and maintenance, or rather, theoretical discussions around the planning and management of digital preservation, and then there was also the practical methods of actually implementing and maintaining digital preservation. So those are the two themes. Regardless, there was kind of one theme to rule them all, which was start where you are. That was one of the best practice takeaways people discussed often. The concept that you probably can't do it perfectly. It's better to get started somewhere and continue moving forward instead of trying to wait. Participants agreed that while it was good to aim for digital preservation practices that adhere to professional standards, small steps are better than nothing. So one of the most popular best practices that was mentioned was policy, developing a policy, following a policy. Another was storage, so discussing, the different types of storage. The concept of locks, lots of copies keep stuff safe was brought up a few times. So, how to what are the best practices in storing digital content? Training, documentation, maintaining metadata, fostering collaboration, following standards, following procedures, providing access, maintaining what you're doing, advocating, assessing, and pretty much any of these best practices kind of also carry with them the idea of consistency, that in doing any of this, being able to reassess what you're doing and also being consistent in the decisions you're making so that the project can be a sustainable. Kind of connected to best practices are the different priorities people would have in managing a digital preservation project or program to try to figure out more about what people feel are priorities with digital preservation, we had a small group activity that presented a hypothetical scenario at a generic cultural institution to kind of ask people, so this place, generally speaking, is trying to do a digital preservation project. Consider what needs to be done from the perspective of the different roles at this institution, or at the different deciding levels, essentially. During those discussions, the most popular areas prioritized by participants were these that are in this slide. So a lot of people cared about budgeting and resources. So how are you finding funding? How are you allocating those resources and personnel? Advocacy support and creating buy-in was another big one. So the priority of communicating why this is important and what the stakes are. Strategic planning, mission and goals. Project management and logistics, so just the nuts and bolts of it, hardware systems and platforms, and then the education and training to make sure you know what you're doing. Generally, people felt that the multiple departments should be closely involved and work together through a committee or task force with representation from all departments. So when talking about different roles, whoever's sharing in this responsibility, they should all be working together or forming a task force of some kind. It was agreed that the head of an organization or someone in a management role should have the primary role in budgeting, strategic planning, with usually the final say in things. While the role that So that could also include setting policy or defining the mission and goals for digital preservation. People who are curators of collections or focused on collection development or management or something like that was usually seen as a person who was a gatekeeper, where they were focusing mostly on the strategic planning, on the implementation, on the day-to-day project management. However, in practice, a lot of people noted that different institutions would require a different distribution of responsibilities and priorities based on their specific needs and limitations. So, for instance, a larger university will probably have multiple roles, multiple personnel to draw from, and different types of resources available to them, whereas a small museum would maybe have just a handful of people sharing all of these responsibilities, or potentially just one person being all the roles. So, in an ideal world, you'd have, this perfect division and delegation, but that's usually not how it actually shakes out. Other potential roles within this that, are tech services, the outward-facing, communication people, so anyone involved in that process, IT. So since we have no questions, I'm going to continue. We then also talked about what are the challenges people are facing with digital preservation. To do this, we had a section within the day where we talked about this, but before that, we had what we called a wall of despair, which allowed people throughout the day at their leisure to kind of add to the wall of despair whatever frustration they're facing with digital preservation. And then we kind of went over what people wrote down and kind of talked about that at more detail. And I'll go through the different kind of categories of challenges that came up through these discussions. The first is getting started. There was a lot of discussion about just the problem of figuring out how to just get started. A lot of institutions don't have digital preservation workflows already developed, so they're kind of starting from scratch, which is an overwhelming process. There's difficulty in knowing where to start, what is appropriate for the size of your institution and the mission of your institution, and it's also difficult to find time and resources to gain that expertise. Most people working in this aren't just quote unquote the digital preservation librarian or archivist. They're usually already have a different job title and doing something separate. So how do you find that time, and how do you find that to prioritize? And also, people weren't always sure where to turn for help, even if they had the time and resources. So even if you had this blocked out, there was still confusion and an issue of just finding out what you're supposed to be doing. There was also challenges with communication and a shared understanding. A lot of people wished for more clarity and understanding with vocabulary and even terms like digital preservation. At the meetings, at the very beginning of each one, we did an exercise, a Post-it exercise, where we kind of did a word association, where we talked about what is digital preservation and access. Like, think of a word that, or a phrase that communicates that to you. What do you think of when you hear digital preservation and access, or digital preservation and storage? And one of the things that came up is it was kind of all over the map in terms of what people, how people consider digital preservation and what kind of things came up. Some people were very specific in certain standards and tools, and some people were very general and broad. And that allowed us to have a conversation to clarify the meaning of certain things and to clarify what we mean by digital preservation. But it took an exercise to do that. Most people don't have that time. So there's a general challenge of just being able to communicate those needs and that shared vocabulary. Fitting many kinds of policies and procedures from administration to central IT into a workflow, but then not getting reciprocal support was also a challenge mentioned. So trying to consider all these different components, but then not really getting that type of support back, or getting that feedback that you need to make sure it's a sustainable process. People also had issues with responsibility and staffing. So one of the questions that commonly came up was, who does digital preservation belong to? Who's responsible for actually doing this and taking the lead in it, and discussing it and managing it? Digital preservation is not something that you can start and have a year-long project on and then, wipe your hands and walk away and be proud of yourself for a job well done. Digital preservation is an ongoing, long-term process. So who's responsible for that? And who does it belong to within any institution? There's also just the issue of turnover and shifting priorities that can be problematic. There's already issues with understaffing, with no one specifically responsible to digital preservation. And when you have things that feel like a much more immediate need, it's easy for that to get kind of kicked down the path until someone has time to deal with it. And then there's also just the issue kind of connected to turnover and shifting priorities, where you lose that training and skill set that might be needed to build that infrastructure and support. Administration also, there's an issue with maybe feeling like administration doesn't understand the complexities leading to unfunded mandates on one extreme, or not providing any support on the other. So, that comes back to the concept of advocacy and support, where digital preservation just doesn't seem like a big priority on an institution-wide scale. So getting that advocacy and getting that support is an issue. Another challenge is finding balance and sustainability. So issues with balancing the ideal, so what should be saved, preserved versus what can be saved and preserved, and managing those expectations. You can't save it all. There's a lot of data in the world. So figuring out what is actually realistic for you in your specific situation, but also what is, that balance between what is realistic for you, but also a best practice. There's also the concept of keeping up with technology and technology changes and shifting best practices. So even if you've got started and you feel really good about it, new tools are released, new preservation systems, new content management systems, new standards, new digital formats. All of these things can come in and just completely throw off whatever workflow you have. So sometimes it's difficult to keep up with that process. Or the shifting changes external to you make suddenly collecting something that wasn't on the scope before a priority. Tweets are a good example of that. I don't know if anyone considered social media a high priority for collecting until suddenly it very much was. Another challenge is just BornDigital stuff. So going back to that concept of formatting, BornDigital material has some similarities to digitized material, but there are a lot of differences, and most people are familiar who work in digital preservation now with managing digitized material. So when developing workflows for BornDigital, it's either not established or it's fuzzy or it's just an insufficient process. And there's a struggle with how to deal with BornDigital material separately from digitized material because it is fundamentally different. And it's a pretty broad subject, right? Like BornDigital formats can really include all sorts of different things. So, how you're going to treat a BornDigital text document like a PDF or something is going to be very different from how you have to approach email or websites or a database, which are all things that people are facing with digital preservation. Are there any questions about challenges? Okay. Guess I'm explaining things super well. On to advice and lessons learned. So after talking through all the different issues people are having, we then kind of turn to the more positive of like, what have you learned? What are things you wish you could have done differently if you were doing it now? How can we build on all of this stuff? Because we definitely have learned things. And there are several things that kind of themes that people walked away from. The first is getting buy-in at a higher level. So people want to be able to communicate how digital preservation will affect other staff and involve other staff in the workflow conversation, and also do that kind of early in the process. There's also a piece of advice or a goal to have someone with influence repeat your digital preservation message to others. So people who can communicate and advocate on your behalf to funders and decision makers can make a huge difference in prioritizing digital preservation initiatives at your institution. Another is that it's actually more about people than it is about technology. That was, again, a theme that came up a lot in all of the meetings, was a interest in talking more about managing the people side of things, as opposed to talking about the different tools people are using or the different software people are having to deal with. And some of the pieces of advice or things that people have learned associated with that is a general thing of being less judgmental and encouraging people where they are, and to rebuild those relationships, which can help in the long run with whatever program you're doing. Whether that means if you're trying to partner with people to encourage them to contribute information and contribute content into your digital preservation collection or your repository, meeting them where they are is more likely to get them to participate. But also it means, like, if you're partnering with people, for instance, on that third bullet, with, like, if you're partnering with IT, weaving what's important to them in your own mission and building that relationship and finding the right person to talk with can really help kind of make that a smoother process. Building trust and, acknowledging that human aspect of working with the IT team. Clearly, a lot of issues with IT, or any other team that you're trying to partner with is also a really important aspect to kind of dealing with people in this process. Another thing that was a lesson learned was the idea of sharing or showing later digital preservation steps to staff that work earlier in the digital preservation process, so they can understand the benefit of what they're being asked to do. Or just the simple concept of explaining the why behind requests you're making of others who don't know or may not have the information available to them to kind of guess that. Because that can help them buy in and that can help them participate and also feel part of the process, as opposed to just being asked suddenly to name all their files in this one way without really understanding why that matters. The third one is have discussions before you begin that inform a good scope and policy document. So really, in other words, plan and make effort to plan early on, because that'll save you a lot of trouble. So connected to that is the concept of outlining things that are in and out of scope to limit scope creep and have something to refer back to when you have questions about why you're not saving this thing or why this isn't in the preservation. Having that outlined and talked about and understood and revisiting that often and treating that like a living document can really help you kind of define what your goals are and what you're working on and why it matters. Maintaining documentation and workflows where you define your audience and make sure that documentation is useful to the people who are actually using it, and you revisit that on a regular basis. Have conversations about why. So instead of just talking about process, also allow yourself that space to assess your process and figure out the why behind certain choices or certain tools or certain programs, so that everyone stays on the same page and so that you can actually grow from it and change it as needed. And then, this is a pretty specific piece of advice, but an important one, use consistent file naming conventions. Or even if you're not talking about file naming, be consistent in the conventions or the standards or the rules that you are using, so that when you're working through your policy and your scope, that consistency is documented and can be relied on, which can really help with passing institutional knowledge down and in the sustainability of your preservation program. Other things connected to this are make preservation part of the initial digitization conversation as well as a part of the priority setting, and kind of skipping a bullet. That is also connected to the idea of talking about digitization and digital preservation in a more unified way to look at when you're looking at a project. So the idea that a lot of people start with digitization, but preservation, the more standards and concepts of digital preservation are included in the digitization process and discussed at that stage, the smoother the whole thing goes. And in kind of including and understanding how these two things work together and what makes them different as well can really help in a project. Clarifying assumptions is another big deal where there's a few examples I have. For instance, if you're inheriting a new project, instead of assuming you already understand the scope of that project and what's going on and what the needs are, to do some extra work to actually audit where all those files connected to that project might be, what work has already been done, interview the people who were previously involved in it, just so that you make sure you're not repeating work or misunderstanding what you're doing. Or another common thing is not assuming that everyone understands or uses a certain phrase the same way you do. Even something as assumed as like digital preservation, people will have a different interpretation of that term. So using a more descriptive language around certain terms you might be using, or creating a shared dictionary when you're doing collaborative work to just help break down any assumptions people might be having about how you're communicating. Connected to all of this, of course, is the idea of thoughtful management of the project and knowing your collection and what people want to see, what's helpful to be digitized or preserved can also really assist in having a successful and sustainable digital preservation program. Another piece of advice was to look for communities of practice and share those with others, and share your community of practice with others. So in other words, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's other people out there probably doing very similar things. Feel comfortable using that expertise on a regional basis and a statewide basis, that those resources are available, and seeking them out will save you a lot of trouble. Compromise is necessary. So digital preservation, situation, workflows, resources, all of those may never be perfect or how you would want them in the ideal world, but you would still, to just continue moving forward and to have something, because the value of digital preservation in and of itself does exist. Picking one thing and tackling it, helping just push something further down instead of leaving it, ignoring it, or letting it just stay festering acknowledging that you can't do it all, and that's okay. And it's also okay to take smaller steps towards digital preservation. There's a lot of stuff. It can be overwhelming. There's a lot of levels you can focus on. It's, do what is reasonable for you in the moment. And then be okay with what you have been able to do. It doesn't have to be fancy or perfect. I think there's a pressure or a need to want to do digital preservation exactly the way you're quote-unquote supposed to do it, and that simply doesn't exist. Your institution is going to have different needs than the other institution, and learning what's important to you and figuring out what is of value and what support you can get can help you move forward in it. For instance, we say be consistent with file naming. It's not the end of the world if that isn't true, that over time that there hasn't been consistency. But what you can do now is start being consistent, and that's fine. And then last, sustainability, and this is mostly tied to money. So grant funding can be instrumental in getting equipment that can help with digitizing things, for storage, for maintaining and processing, but a lot of the stuff that grant funding can provide may still require long-term maintenance fees and other sort of needs. So understanding how to be sustainable in the project beyond the grant funding is important. But notable is that grant funding can give you that leg up and get you started. Are there any questions about the advice and lessons learned? Okay. And last, we talked about needs and opportunities. So for needs, people of all three meetings came up with really similar ideas related to how their digital preservation needs could be addressed. And the main ones that they discussed was that they need more information and expertise shared within the state to kind of help with eliminating those silos and eliminating that idea that you're kind of on your own. They need digital preservation hosting and storage, so assistance or support in some way in getting the tools and hosting and storage that they need to be able to actually do digital preservation, and need outlets for collaboration within the state, so support and outlets for that collaboration. That is so important. In discussing needs, especially in sharing information and expertise, a lot of people suggested a single online resource that would include sample documentation, best practices, guidelines, bibliography, links to recommended tools, all sorts of things. And there was also an interest in creating a directory or a guide that lists kind of a who's doing what and who's an authority on X topic to kind of help provide access to different regional peers for people to find as they get started or if they have a question. In-person collaboration and learning opportunities were also highly desired, as long as those could be low or no cost. And sharing current work and having a cohort of peers to ask questions, brainstorm would be desirable, as well as being able to have a more formal way of sharing expertise, either through consultants or organized workshops or webinars. People overwhelmingly preferred in person for all of these things, but also understood that travel can be difficult and require more of an investment of time and resources. People suggested using conference calls, webinars, and e-listserv as a way of communicating all this stuff out, but there was not like one all-powerful answer. And in addition to all of this, we talked about training needs. People came up with different ideas and areas that they would like to get training in. A beginning skills boot camp for digital preservation, help with digital appraisal, where someone could come and help them actually look at what they have and where they need to get started, and help with assessing where an institution is, i.e., levels of the digital preservation being accomplished. That was something that came up a lot, the idea of developing kind of a system of levels to help people, guide people about see where they could be in a process of developing digital preservation initiatives at their institution, but also where they could be going. Other training is help with project management for organizations starting in digital preservation, help with BornDigital materials or addressing those bigger questions related to them, advice on advocating digital preservation work, and then finding funding opportunities, help navigating writing grants, and figuring out what is actually needed for digital preservation. We discussed different opportunities for people to seek out this type of information that might already exist. There was a desire for low-cost, externally managed hosting and storage that would provide basic digital preservation services, and many people, institutions have because many people's institutions neither have technical expertise or infrastructure to really build out those systems on their own. While there are some systems and services available on the market, they're usually targeted towards larger institutions or businesses. So proposed hosting and storage would ideally be feasible for a smaller institution or a group of smaller institutions without any requirement on their part to have significant local expertise or technology. So that was a big component. In addition to that training is that idea of figuring out how we can be more consortial, essentially. And then finally, there was a great desire for collaborations that expand beyond a single institution to include all cultural heritage professionals doing this type of work. Rather than solutions tailored to a library or a museum environment per se, the participants really were looking for solutions that could agnostically serve North Carolina cultural heritage institutions of all types. And with that in mind, instead of reinventing the wheel, it was suggested that there are already organizations that might play a part in fostering some collaborations. So on a state with organizations with a statewide mandate already, like the State Library or the State Archives or the Digital Heritage Center, NC Live. There's also professional organizations, Society of North Carolina Archivists, North Carolina Library Association, Museums Council, Preservation Consortium, and then also regional collaborations, Metrolina Library Association, Triangle Research Libraries Network, and Western North Carolina Library Network, to name a few. One of the things that did come up as a theme, too, or kind of a realization, is because we had a mixed group of participants from different types of institutions, but we limited it more by region, people found that even though, as kind of already mentioned, even though they are from, say, a public library, figuring out collaborations and talking to other institutions that are in their region that have similar issues, whether or not they're a public library, seemed particularly helpful. So meeting a museum that's down the road or a town over that's the similar size and dealing with similar issues because they're in the same kind of area of North Carolina dealing with a similar population, that became kind of a realization that is a potential for partnership. And it's not just public libraries working with public libraries, universities partnering with universities, that we can kind of cross that line and consider cultural institutions on a more broad scope when we talk about digital preservation. Are there any questions about the needs and opportunities? Okay. So based on all of this stuff, the Planning Committee has suggested a pretty admittedly vague action plan for moving forward. The first and foremost is that we know that research is needed of those needs and opportunities we just discussed, and which ones can be realistically addressed kind of sooner than later. So what's realistic to do within the next 6 months, or within a 6-month period within reason. And then in addition to that, there's also research is needed and we want to do research of which of the needs and opportunities or versions of them would require funding or substantial support, and to determine a best course of action for those things 6 months to a year out. So, what are the things we can immediately start working on that are kind of the low-hanging fruit to start addressing needs and exploring that? Let's research that. And then also, what's the stuff that might carry more weight and need us to focus, maybe write a grant or find more partnerships or investigate farther. regardless of that, we want to determine approaches that are communicative, inclusive, sustainable, and actually relevant to the needs discussed. And of course, this is a living process, right? So those needs may shift. People will have different needs. It might be region-specific or institution or status-specific, and that's okay, but being considerate of how we're communicating it out, who we're including in the conversation, and how realistic what we're proposing actually is important. And then, of course, continuing this communication and resource sharing with all the people that participated in the meetings, participated today, or want to participate in the future, so that we can keep this going, into the future. We don't just have these meetings and then share this report and then kind of move on. So those are the next steps that the kind of action plan of like where we want to go next for now. And that's my overview of the report. So we're now moving into the discussion and questions portion. So I'm going to unmute everybody. So if you are, now that I've unmuted you, if there is a lot of static noise where you are, or if you do not want to be unmuted, please mute yourself. And so now the floor is open. People can type a question or an idea that they want to bring up. If there's a comment about the report, I've kind of posted these prompts or considerations on this slide as potential places to get started. If anyone wants to answer any of these questions. But I'll stop talking now. So one of the questions I have for anyone who participated in any of the meetings is just, did we miss anything? Or was there anything you remembered from the meeting you attended that you wish I had talked about or that you thought about later and want to add to? Oh, I have a question. Does the project team have initial ideas of what falls into the categories listed, next 6 months, grant projects, et cetera? That's a good question. I of course seem to always have opinions and ideas. I think that some of the stuff that feels, and of course this is just me talking, so the others can also speak to what they want. But I think things like generating a list of resources, allowing, having a list of potential contacts that people can reach out to or touch on, making sure people have access to different training opportunities. All of those things can start pretty soon or earlier in the process because there's not there's not as much of a stake involved in that. That's just producing a resource, which I feel like is a more immediately feasible thing. Heather says, not sure if everyone has seen the OSARC Flow project, but it documents workflows and digital archiving at samples of institutions. And it might be helpful to create a repository or current digital preservation workflows at participant institutions for those willing, able to share them. So yes, that's a great resource and a potential resource for us to kind of partner with and talk with. But I don't know if anyone else on the Plan Committee had other ideas about what could be kind of tackled sooner than later, or later than sooner.
looking at some of the applications. Yes. You got our number one candidate in there right off the bat. Martha. Cool. Yes. I am.
So another, like, a long-term thing is any discussion about consortium or a program, like a statewide program, would require a little bit more investigation and coordination.
Oh, I know. So, yeah, just talking. Oh boy, that went on.
I heard a lot of talking, but I'm not sure if it was intended to be heard by everybody. So if you were trying to share with the group, you might need to repeat yourself.
Did I do my call on you given Wednesday? Oh, yes. I need to go back and get, after I got all of these people in one place, I need to go see them. Now, do you do giving? Do they giving special campaign? Okay. I already gave, Lord. I gave it all. Yeah. Yeah, you've already given. I got you that.
So Annie just shared that there's a NCPC workshop coming up that she's teaching that addresses a lot of the training needs identified. So if people are interested in investigating that farther, that is a potential opportunity. And she provided a link in the comments.
I just posted a link in the comments as well.
Great, thank you, David. So you say that there's the U.S. National Archives, so NARA, released a digital preservation framework on GitHub for public comment. So here's what that looks like.
It looks like that same old unuser-friendly GitHub interface.
Yep. And thank you, Annie. I agree. The focus of the importance of people over technology kind of surprised me. I think if you had asked me before we did the meetings, what are going to be the things that are talked about the most, because of where I'm at and how my brain works, I would have expected more conversation about what storage systems or preservation systems people are using, what tools they're using, what are the technical issues they're having, and I would have been really off the mark in terms of what is the actual current climate and situation with a lot of people in North Carolina, or at least a lot of the people that participated in our meetings. So it was very helpful to be like, oh, we need to talk on a much broader scale. And it also is a more varied issue from both a regional standpoint and like type of institution, kind of all these different capacities. Jamie is sharing that she knows a lot of Council of State Archivists, has a lot of resources, and says, I wonder if a challenge will be not duplicating efforts, but being aware of what's out there, taking advantage of that and finding exactly where the gaps are that we can fill in regionally and locally. And I completely agree. That is, you don't know what you don't know, and that is kind of a common issue or frustration, is knowing even how to research it or find it and identifying it. And any of the links shared in the comments today, I'll make an effort to gather them all, and when I share out the recording with you, I will also share those links so that you don't have to rush to try to copy and paste them now. Are there any other questions people have about the project, about next steps, about the report, about digital preservation? Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and start wrapping up early, but feel free to yell at me to stop, because I, of course, do not want to keep us on the phone unnecessarily long. Of course, if at any point you have additional questions and do want to share them, we have another one. So in the Eastern Regional meeting, we talked about communication channels a lot, like how the Slack channel didn't take off or that folks don't want to join a listserv. But if something were to develop there, I'd be happy to join to try and stay more connected. And yes, you're right. Like I agree that people kind of talked about listservs sound exciting in the initial conversation, and then when it comes to actual initiation, it ends up being, this is another email I'm getting. And that kind of became a discussion of how do we solve for that. But thank you for saying that you would be happy to participate and make that effort, because I think that is one of the more obvious ways of kind of communicating a lot of information with a lot of people on a regular basis. If anyone has any other suggestions of how to kind of maintain communication and what different communication channels available, we certainly would like to hear it, or what's worked for them. Thank you. Yeah, and as I was kind of saying, if after this, anyone has any questions or comments, or after you kind of digest the report more, or consider whatever on your own time, you can always contact us and provide your thoughts and feelings and comments concerns, questions, whatever it is, gathering that information and insight is really important in all of this entire process. So hearing from the people actually on the ground dealing with the thing really helps us make sure we're not missing a mark. I'm going to put this, the action plan back up just to kind of help remind, like, this is the hope and goal that we'll do some more research on what people actually expressed as needs and opportunities and figuring out where we can go from here. I think the concept of sustainable is really important and realistic. So what forms of support can be considered that are actually going to help people be relevant and long-term effective? And of course, we won't always know for sure whatever we decide will actually be long-term effective, but we'll do our best. And of course, if anybody is, wants to be more involved in any of this process or wants to contribute in any way or have any, or, as part of an organization that they think could help provide support, whatever it is, definitely contact me. There's no guarantee at the moment that anything solid will happen, but I want to make sure I have that information gathered so that we know who's interested in being engaged and at what level. It is an open door, so definitely know that you can volunteer if you want. So I'll go ahead. Thank you so much. I really appreciate all of you taking the time to come today and to listen to me talk for an hour and for engaging with this, because I know I personally really think digital preservation is important, but I know a lot of other people have to tackle this in some way. And I think having these conversations out in the open and getting together can be a really fruitful process. So thank you for taking the time. Just as a reminder, the recording, I'll share it in an email with all of the links provided in these chats. Lisa says thank you as well. Apparently her mic's not working. But I'll share the links and also the recording once it's available via email, but it'll also be made available online and a link will be provided. Thank you very much, Timothy. It's been a pleasure working with everybody, and I'm proud of our work, so I look forward to seeing what happens next. And with that, I'm going to leave it on this slide, another thank you. And also, this is an email, digital.info@ncdcr.gov. It is an email that is monitored by multiple digital staff at the State Library. So feel free to email this and use this as a contact email for any questions related to this project. That way, if I'm for any reason not here, you're not just sending it into a void while I'm on vacation or something. So please feel free to use that email, or of course contact me directly if you already feel comfortable doing that. But thank you so much, and we'll be in touch.